You have too many interests. Everyone tells you that's a gift. They say you're curious, dynamic, well-rounded, and you believe them. You keep collecting skills, starting new projects, jumping between passions, wondering why nothing ever sticks. But the truth is much darker. You aren't curious. You are afraid. But here's what no one tells you. The problem isn't that you have too many interests. In fact, that's not a weakness. It's potential. But potential means nothing if it goes in different directions. The real problem is that your interests are not working together. They're pulling you in different directions, instead of building something real in one. And that comes down to how you're actually using them. Because for most people, multiple interests aren't a sign of curiosity. They're a defense mechanism. They are the most sophisticated form of self-sabotage ever invented. And until you understand what's actually happening beneath the surface, you will keep running. You will keep pivoting. You will keep almost arriving, but never quite getting there. There is a psychological principle called diffusion of identity. It states that when a person cannot tolerate the vulnerability of full commitment, they spread themselves across multiple identities to avoid the pain of being truly seen in any one of them. Think about that. Your many interests may not be feeding you. They may be hiding you. Today we are going to go deep into what people with too many interests are actually missing. Not productivity hacks. Not time management tricks. Something far more fundamental than that. Something that changes the entire game once you see it. This diffusion serves a specific psychological function. When you maintain multiple concurrent identities, none of them can fully threaten you. If you are simultaneously a potential writer, entrepreneur, designer, and musician, then criticism of your writing does not land the way it would if you were primarily a writer. The blow is distributed across a portfolio of selves. This distribution feels protective, and it is. But protection, by definition, requires energy. It requires constant maintenance. It requires you to keep all these identities warm and active enough that they remain plausible escape routes. The maintenance itself becomes a form of work that masquerades as progress. You are busy. You are engaged. You are learning. But you are also isolated from the actual verdict. The verdict that comes only when you have put everything you have into one direction and discovered what you are actually capable of. That verdict is the thing you are protecting yourself from. Here is the open loop you need to hold. There is one thing, one specific psychological move, that separates people who are genuinely multi-talented from people who are merely scattered. It is not discipline. It is not focus. It is not even talent. Most people never identify it. And by the end of this, you will. But we have to build to it. Because if you just get the answer without the architecture, it won't land. It won't change anything. You will file it away with every other piece of advice you've collected and forgotten. So stay with this. The first thing we need to destroy is the story you've been telling yourself about why you are the way you are. You've been calling it curiosity. You've been calling it intelligence. You've been saying you just love learning. And maybe that's partly true. But ask yourself honestly, when was the last time one of your interests became something real? When did curiosity turn into mastery? When did learning turn into building? If the answer is rarely or never, then the curiosity narrative is a comfortable lie. Here is what is actually happening. When you pursue a new interest, your brain releases dopamine, not when you master something, when it is new. The novelty itself is the reward. Neuroscientists call this the exploration-exploitation trade-off. Your brain is wired to explore when the environment feels uncertain or threatening. Exploration feels productive. It feels intelligent. It looks like growth from the outside. But here is the brutal distinction. Exploration without exploitation is just wandering. You can wander for decades and call it a journey. Most people do. The psychological truth is this. Chronic multi-interest behavior is often rooted in what Carl Jung called the inflation of the ego. The ego, when it feels threatened by the possibility of failure in a specific domain, inflates itself across many domains. You cannot fail at the thing you never fully committed to. You cannot be judged for the identity you never fully claimed. So you stay in motion. Motion feels like progress. But motion and direction are not the same thing. The dopamine cycle itself deserves deeper examination. When a new interest captures your attention, your brain enters a state of heightened neural plasticity. This neurological state feels energizing. It feels like potential. Your brain is literally lighting up with the possibility of new pathways, new competencies, new versions of yourself. This sensation is addictive, not in a clinical sense, but in a real sense. The human nervous system is drawn to it, and the modern world has learned to exploit this. Every platform, every algorithm, every notification is designed to give you more of this sensation, more novelty, more beginnings, more reasons to explore. This is not a personal failing. This is an environmental design that preys on the way human brains are actually wired. Understanding this distinction matters because it moves you from shame to clarity. You are not weak for being drawn to novelty. You are human. The question is whether you are going to remain at the mercy of that design or whether you are going to build a counter-design. Let that land. Because this is where most people get defensive. You are not curious. You are afraid. Not afraid of hard work, not afraid of learning, afraid of the verdict, afraid of the moment when you go all in on one thing and the world tells you what you are actually worth. Every new interest resets the clock. It gives you another beginning, and beginnings are safe because they carry no track record. When you are a beginner, you cannot be a failure. You are just starting out. The problem is, you have been just starting out for years, possibly decades. And somewhere underneath the excitement of every new beginning, there is a quiet, creeping dread. The dread that maybe you are not as exceptional as you think you are. That maybe the real version of you, fully committed to one thing, would be ordinary. That is what you're protecting yourself from. And it is costing you everything. Now here is where things start to shift. Because this is not about shame. Understanding this pattern is not a verdict on your character. It is a map. And a map only becomes useful when you are willing to look at it honestly. The people who have truly built something with their range of interests share one trait that scattered people consistently miss. They have what psychologists call a unifying axis, a single, non-negotiable core identity around which every interest orbits. Think of it like a solar system. The sun does not chase the planets. The planets organize around the sun. If you have many interests but no sun, you have debris. Beautiful, intelligent, constantly moving debris. But debris. Leonardo da Vinci had dozens of interests. He studied anatomy, engineering, painting, mathematics, optics, music. But his unifying axis was understanding the mechanics of nature. Every interest served that axis. He wasn't scattered. He was converged through a single lens. What is your lens? Most people with too many interests have never asked that question. They are so busy collecting that they have never asked what the collection is for. This unifying axis operates differently than most people imagine. It is not restrictive in the way a single career path is restrictive. It is liberating in a specific way. Because once you have identified the organizing principle, the range actually becomes a competitive advantage. Your interests stop competing for your attention and start feeding each other. The mathematician, who is also a writer, is not divided between two pursuits. Both pursuits are explorations of the same underlying question about pattern, structure, and communication. The entrepreneur who studies history is not taking a detour. They are gathering data for the same central investigation. The visual artist who codes is not switching gears. They are approaching the same problem from different angles. This is what integration looks like. And it is radically different from the scattered approach, where you move from interest to interest looking for the one that will finally stick. The process of identifying your unifying axis requires a specific kind of introspection that most people avoid. You have to look at the pattern of what actually interests you, not what you think should interest you. You have to see what themes recur across your different pursuits. What questions keep emerging? What problems keep pulling at you? What pattern exists beneath the surface of seemingly unrelated interests? This is detective work, archaeological work. It requires patience. It requires sitting with discomfort. But it is the most practical work you can do, because once you identify the axis, the paralysis that comes from too many options disappears. This is where things become interesting. Because the unifying axis is not a passion, it is not a goal, it is not a career path, it is a question. A single question that your life is trying to answer. And when you find it, everything reorganizes. Your interests stop competing and start cooperating. The psychology research here is clear. Studies on high performers across creative fields consistently show that range is not the variable that predicts success. Integration is. The ability to take multiple domains and pull them through a single organizing principle. Without that principle, range is just noise. With it, range becomes an edge.
The scattered person and the integrated person can have identical interests, but their trajectories are completely different. One is building, one is browsing. You've probably felt it. The moment right after you start something new. The rush, the possibility, the sense that this time it will be different. And then, weeks later, the slow cooling, the loss of novelty, the friction of the middle stage where you are no longer a beginner, but nowhere near mastery. And then the pivot. Another interest appears, shinier, newer, full of possibility again. Psychologists call this the intermediate collapse. It is the point where genuine growth requires tolerance of discomfort, and the brain, offered a more rewarding alternative, defects. This is not weakness. This is design. Your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. The problem is, you are living in the wrong environment for that design. The modern world offers infinite novelty on demand. Your brain was not built for that. No brain was. And without deliberate structure, without a unifying axis, without a conscious reason to stay, your default will always be to leave right before the breakthrough. The intermediate collapse happens with predictable regularity because it serves the same psychological function every time. It interrupts the growth process right before you would have to fully claim the identity, right before commitment becomes undeniable, right before there is no going back to just exploring. This is the critical juncture. This is where depth is born, or where the pattern perpetuates. Most people do not understand that they have a choice at this point. They experience it as involuntary. The interest simply fades. The novelty wears off. The timing just never works out. They do not see that they are unconsciously orchestrating their own departure. And understanding this is not about self-judgment. It is about recognizing that you have more agency in this pattern than you have been exercising. Here is the pattern. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Every interest you abandon at approximately the same psychological stage. Not the same amount of time, the same emotional stage. The stage where the identity starts to crystallize, where people start to see you as the person who does this thing, where the commitment starts to feel real. And therefore, reversible choices start to feel permanent. That is the moment you flee. Not because the interest lost value, because the identity gained weight. Commitment is not about time, it is about identity. And your nervous system treats identity like a threat. Because an identity can be judged, an identity can be wrong, an identity can fail publicly in a way that a hobby never can. So you stay in hobby mode, permanently, professionally, psychologically. And you wonder why nothing compounds. This is the thing people with too many interests miss. Compounding. Not financial compounding, identity compounding. When you commit to a single axis and stay with it through the intermediate collapse, something happens that scattered people never experience. Your skills start to cross-pollinate beneath the surface. The thing you learned in one domain creates an unexpected insight in another. Connections appear that no one who stayed in a single lane would ever see. This is the actual genius of range. But it only activates after depth. Range without depth is cocktail conversation. Range after depth is a different species of thinking entirely. And the cruel irony is this. The people who use many interests to avoid depth never access the power that multiple interests actually unlock. They are sitting on an engine they never learned to start. Pause. Because there is a voice right now saying you are different. Your situation is more complicated. Your interests are genuinely unrelated. You tried committing and it didn't work. You hear that voice. It is the same voice that has been protecting you for years. It is convincing. It has good arguments. It has evidence. But ask yourself this: what has that voice built? Not started, not explored, built. There is a Stoic principle that Marcus Aurelius returned to constantly. Waste no more time arguing about what a good person should be. Be one. The same logic applies here. Stop arguing about whether your range is a strength or a liability. The argument itself is the avoidance. The analysis is the procrastination. You already know what you need to do. You have known for a long time. The question is whether you are willing to pay the price that commitment actually costs. What does it cost? It costs the other identities, and this is where the real resistance lives. Because when you commit to one axis, you are not just choosing something, you are letting something go. Every person who has ever built something real has a graveyard of abandoned possibilities behind them. Not because those possibilities were worthless, because they understood that optionality is not freedom. Optionality is the illusion of freedom. Real freedom is the feeling you get when you have gone deep enough in one direction that you can see things other people simply cannot see. That is irreplaceable. No amount of breadth purchases what depth creates. And the people who hoard their options, who refuse to close doors, who keep every interest alive in case they might need it later, they stay at the surface of everything and the bottom of nothing. Here's the reframe that changes the architecture of this entire conversation. You are not a person with too many interests who needs to pick one and give up the rest. That framing is wrong. That framing is why every productivity system you've tried eventually collapsed. You are a person who has not yet identified your organizing question. And once you identify it, you don't lose your interests. You stop being distracted by them. They stop pulling you in different directions and start pulling in the same direction. The musician who is also obsessed with mathematics is not divided. They are converged around the question of pattern and structure. The entrepreneur who studies philosophy is not scattered. They are organized around the question of how people make meaning. Find the question your life is already asking. Everything else becomes obvious. Your interests are not the problem. The absence of a frame is the problem. But here's what most people don't realize. The organizing question is not something you think your way into. It is something you excavate. It lives underneath the interests, not above them. And the excavation requires a specific kind of stillness that people with too many interests systematically avoid. Because stillness means confronting the question you have been outrunning. The question of what you actually want. Not what you find interesting. Not what you are capable of. What you want to build before you are done. That question has weight. It has consequences. It narrows the field. And narrowing feels like loss before it feels like power. But the narrowing is not the end of your range. It is the beginning of your depth. And depth is the only place where your range becomes dangerous. Most people reading this will feel the recognition. That specific sensation of something you already knew being put into words you could not access yourself. And recognition is a good sign. It means you are close. It means the organizing question is near the surface. But recognition is not enough. The gap between people who transform and people who consume transformation content is not intelligence. It is not even desire. It is the willingness to sit with one answer long enough for it to become real. You can understand this completely and change nothing. Or you can take the one insight that landed hardest in this entire script and follow it one level deeper. Not into a new interest, into the one you already know matters most. That is the move. Not because it is easy, because it is the only one that compounds. That's the shift, not doing more, but finally making everything you do move in the same direction. You clicked because you were afraid, but the pattern is finally visible. Recognizing the pattern is one level. Knowing how to move through the people who benefit from keeping you scattered, that is something else entirely.
Because not everyone in your life wants you to find your axis. Some of them are more comfortable with the version of you that never quite arrives. And learning to see that clearly, learning to read the signals before they cost you time you cannot recover, that is what comes next. Because the truth is, some people don't want you to fail. They just don't want you to focus long enough to succeed. They prefer you scattered, because a person with no axis is a person who can be easily managed. And they've become experts at hiding that intent behind a smile. But what if you could see what's actually happening behind the face they show the world? What if you knew exactly when the mask was slipping? That is where we are going next. If something here resonated with you, let me know in the comments. And if you want to go deeper into the patterns most people never see, make sure you're subscribed.